Okay, everyone, so we are on the very last leg of this marathon sprint that we are doing through all of the first wave civilizations. And so the last couple that we have to talk about include the Indus River Valley and China and the Olmec. And then you guys will be done for the week. And I realize that this has been a lot of material to cover, but hopefully breaking it up into smaller chunks has helped at least a little bit. The Indus River Valley is also known as the Harappan civilization, named after the sister cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. It was located along the Indus River and the Saraswati River in the area of modern-day Pakistan. Of all the civilizations we have looked at, this one is the largest. It is spread out over a huge chunk of land, and for the most part, you see these very elaborately planned cities that are all unified by the same use of red clay brick and have monumental architecture as well as amazing sanitation systems that sometimes rival those that exist in India today. The environment of the Indus River Valley is similar geographically to ancient Egypt as well as Norte Chico in Peru. There were very rich agricultural lands surrounded by highland mountains and the desert, and on one side, ocean. And you see some of the same environmental devastation here in the form of repeated irrigation of their soil, causing salinization of the soil, which then lowered their crop yields and sometimes led to famine. And also you see massive deforestation and soil erosion. And the reason they were cutting the trees down was so that they could use them to bake red clay bricks in their ovens in order to create the cities for which the Indus River Valley is so famous now. Although Hinduism as a major religious tradition had not started at this point, you do see the roots of Hinduism and the Eastern worldview in the very early Indus River Valley civilization. And some examples of this are that these early people worshipped a mother goddess, both Parvati and Sakti, and these mother goddesses symbolize fertility, which was later seen in the Hindu religion. They also regarded cows as sacred. They bathed in the river for religious reasons, and they often considered rivers to be holy sites. And one other thing is that we have found seals from throughout the area, and they are in the form of swastikas. And these swastikas are often found in Eastern religions, although they were co-opted by the Nazis and Hitler to, mean racism and hatred. Originally, they actually meant peace in the Eastern tradition. So when you see them in the Indus River Valley, make sure that you don't confuse them with the later definition that's been attributed to swastikas. And in fact, if you were to straighten a swastika out, it would form a cross, another universal symbol of peace and of love. It has proven a bit more difficult for historians and archaeologists to understand the political system of the Indus River Valley. There are no palaces, no temples, no elaborate grave sites that we found in other areas located here. And we don't believe that there were any kings or warrior classes. There's really no indication of political hierarchy or of one centralized state, and there's very little concentration of wealth in the hands of individuals. So if we want to understand the kind of specialization that we see in these cities and the complexity of the Indus River Valley, we have to assume that there was probably some kind of municipal government, that each one of these cities had some kind of leadership form. We don't know. Maybe it was ruled by warriors, maybe by priests, maybe it was a combination of these. Maybe there was one overarching ruler over all of the different cities or several chiefs ruling over each city. We're really unsure of exactly what the political system is, but we know that it was based around the city. One thing that has provided a clue for us is that we know that there is evidence of bureaucracy. There were standardized weights throughout the Indus River Valley, standardized measurements. The architectural styles were extremely similar. And in every single one of the Indus River Valley civilizations, we see the same size and shape and consistency of red clay brick, which means that they must have had some kind of overarching bureaucratic structure that created some form of stability within their society and allowed them to create these massive engineering feats. The ancient Indus River Valley really relied upon irrigated agriculture to feed its people and as the basis of its economy. In a lot of ways, it was an agricultural village, and it provided the foundation of their civilization. And they were responsible for domesticating several crops, such as peas and sesame seeds and dates, also for domesticating cotton. And India will become a major player in the cotton textile trade later on in history. And then also they domesticated several animals, probably the most important of which is the water buffalo. Because of the sheer size and strength of the animal, it could be used for many different things. We know that most people who lived in their cities were traders or artisans, and that they were supported by the poorer farmers, and they would live within these cities in these well-defined neighborhoods with others who had the same occupation as they did, forming little communities. And then the last thing that we know about the economy of the Indus River Valley is that they developed a very strong system of trade. They were able to trade with Mesopotamia in the Middle East, located near them, and also able to trade with China, located over to the eastern side. So they would be right smack dab in the middle of the Silk Roads come the Middle Ages. So they were in quite a good position. They were also located right next to the Arabian Sea. They could get into the Red Sea and the Caspian Sea. So they had a pretty strong control of the area nearby. One of, in my opinion, the most remarkable things about the Indus River Valley is that they have the world's first known urban sanitation systems that some people living in Pakistan or India today would say were even more efficient than what's available to them. Homes in every single one of their cities would get water, clean water from wells, and wastewater would then run through the covered drains that lined the major streets. And houses would be formed in such a way that they would open only to inner courtyards and to smaller lanes. And that way, if there was any kind of disease epidemic being spread, you could sort of quarantine yourself away from those who were sick. And all of this is fairly advanced technology for the time period. The sister cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were cities with a population of about 40,000 people right on the banks of the Indus River, and they featured these very large, richly built homes that could be anywhere from 2 to 3 stories tall, and they had indoor plumbing with these luxurious, beautiful bathrooms and private wells, and all of the streets would be laid out in a grid-like pattern, the way that uptown Charlotte is, and beneath there was this very complex sewage system so that nobody had to worry about getting sick. And then all of the workers would go live in these standardized 2-room houses, so they didn't have a great deal of homelessness in the Indus River Valley. They also had grand public buildings. They had an enormous public bath that was a part of their religious belief system, an enormous citadel that was surrounded by 45 feet tall, a big brick wall that went around it as well. Archaeologists have been lucky enough to find a great deal of art from the ancient Indus River Valley civilization, and this art includes a lot of different sculptures and seals, such as those with swastikas on them, pottery, gold jewelry, these detailed figurines with correct anatomy that were done out of this terracotta bronze has also been found at excavation sites. A lot of crafts like shell working and ceramics and agate bead making were used in order to make necklaces and bangles and other ornaments that would have been worn by both men and women in the society. The fall of the Indus River Valley civilization can really be attributed to the 2 environmental factors that we talked about earlier, and that would be massive deforestation as well as soil erosion that caused people to abandon their cities and move by about 1700 BCE. But you're still going to see that a lot of the features of first wave Indus River Valley are going to continue into the second wave empire in India. And these would include ceremonial bathing and ritual burning in the form of sati, as well as yoga and the use of bulls and elephants as religious symbols, the sacredness of water, and cows, as well as different styles of clothing and jewelry that you'll see again in the classical era. The second to last civilization we have is ancient China, and it was located along the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. And throughout most of the first wave, it continued its imperialistic tendencies and expanded into territory beyond what was already owned at the beginning of the first wave. So the environment in some ways is similar to that of ancient Mesopotamia, in that the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers often overflowed into the valley, which would cause issues with drowning their crops and causing famine. And there was a huge environmental impact of the first Chinese state, in that the centralized state really begins under their first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, and Emperor Wu went in and began to organize flood control projects to create these huge channels that would keep the land from flooding and destroying the crops if the river was to overflow. And many of these channels were upkept throughout the second wave, the third wave, and have even continued into the modern day. The ancient Chinese worshipped many gods, which means that they had a polytheistic religion, and these included weather gods and sky gods, with their supreme god being Shangdi, who would have ruled over the entire pantheon of gods. They believed that their ancestors became like gods when they died, and they worshipped them as gods as well. I think a good example of this could be the Disney movie Mulan. And while Mulan has actually mixed a bit of Japanese and Chinese culture, there are several scenes that show her praying to her ancestors and show the relationship she has with her ancestors that would be fairly accurate for this time period. We also know that they did practice human sacrifice. When we talk about Emperor Chen Shi Huangdi in the second wave, he had a burial tomb in which there were thousands of clay soldiers that were buried with him to guard him in the afterlife. But he also buried alive all of his concubines, numbering in the hundreds, as well as all of the builders of his mausoleum. And this was done so that they could not carry on the secrets of the emperor, and so that they could keep him company in the afterlife. And it would not be unusual for them to either be buried alive or to be beheaded. I suppose maybe they'd be more lucky to be beheaded first. But it wasn't something that was practiced on a large scale, and it would really only have been done by the ruler. Obviously, the political system of ancient China was one with an emperor in charge. Originally, the ruler was called the Son of Heaven, and this is where they get the concept of the mandate of heaven, that their supreme god, Shangdi, has chosen this man to be the emperor and vested him with unlimited power. And were he to be overthrown, which will happen occasionally in the form of other families attempting to overthrow the emperor, or peasants attempting to overthrow the wealthy classes, then they would assume that their supreme god no longer supported the emperor. Now, throughout the course, you'll hear me talk about different dynasties. And when we say that China was ruled by dynasties, we simply mean that there were families that passed control down from one generation to the next to the next. And these dynasties could be as short as 15 years, or they could be as long as 800 years. So there would have been a great deal of cultural continuity in the dynasties that lasted the longest. There are just 3 dynasties for you to know about in the first wave. The first of these is the Xia dynasty, and because it was the first dynasty, we didn't really have any written records of this time period, so archaeologists and historians, they don't really know a whole lot about the time period, other than the fact that this is when they engaged in the massive irrigation and engineering feats, such as building the canals to keep the river from flooding their crops. The Shang dynasty is the second dynasty, and there were 31 emperors in this dynasty. And it's the first time we actually have a written language that expands throughout the area. And we also see the Chinese state expanding to encompass all of the territory between the Pacific Ocean and Mongolia. And then the last dynasty is the Shu dynasty, and its claim to fame is that this was the longest lasting in all of Chinese history. This was the one that lasted about 800 years. The way that the social system worked in ancient China is that it was a feudal state, and you've probably learned about feudalism before in relation to the Middle Ages in Western Europe, where you have the idea of a king, and underneath him are nobles that own tracts of land, and under the nobles are knights as well as peasants that work on the land. And it's a similar system in ancient China, where the ruler will appoint nobles to control smaller parts of the empire, and then the nobles will divide their land up into farms for their extended family, from cousins to second cousins, and then the families are going to have an oath of loyalty to the nobility because they're allowed to live on that land and farm it, and the nobles will have an oath of loyalty to the emperor. And in the end, should the nobles need anyone to fight for them in a war, then they can rely upon the peasants who are working on their land. And the peasants will know that they have some form of protection if they live on the land of the nobility. So there's really a system of exchange that's tied to the giving of land in feudalism. Rulers would then tax their subjects and use the wealth to build these huge walls around their cities to defend their citizens from the northern nomads, first the Huns and then later the Mongols, and also to build roads and irrigation systems and dams. And so it kept society well structured, and it sort of paves the way for the building of the Great Wall of China later in history. One of the most common features that you'll notice in all the different waves of Chinese civilization is a conflict between the wealthy landowners and the poorer peasants who were really taxed heavily and treated badly. So up at the top of the social pyramid would have been the kings and their nobles. They would have lived in the best homes and palaces. They would have had bronze weapons and nice candlesticks and cutlery and plates, and lived really a lavish lifestyle. Compared to below them were warriors, and these were the most high-ranking of the soldiers, who would have been knights in bronze armor that would have gone out to battle in these horse-drawn chariots. The foot soldiers would have been beneath the warriors. Usually they were just peasants who were forced to leave their fields in the middle of the season and go fight as a result of that oath of loyalty they had sworn to the nobility. And typically these came from the farmers, and these farmers just lived very simple lives in a village back home with very simple homes, and sometimes you would have several generations of family living in one little structure. They worked the land that was assigned to them by the royalty with these very primitive stone and wood tools. They worked incredibly hard. They had difficult lives, very harsh lives. They often died from exposure to the elements or from lack of food. And then the merchants are really the last group who would have existed outside of this system of class altogether. They were seen as being ignoble and dishonorable because they took the work that other men had done and then they sold it and made a profit without ever getting their hands dirty. And while the peasants were treated very poorly throughout Chinese history, they were really idealized in the ideology of the state because they were considered the backbone of the Chinese economic industry. But these merchants posed really a threat to the kings or the emperors as well as the nobility because they had just as much wealth as the nobility did. They were often afraid that these merchants might attempt to overthrow them. So merchants were not allowed to dress in the same color or clothing as the nobility. They couldn't wear silk like the nobility could. They couldn't ride horses or they would be arrested. There was a very strong and very strictly maintained line that was differentiating those who were considered to be part of the nobility and those who were merchants. And this class system will really stay intact throughout several waves of Chinese civilization. The Chinese civilization was really located at a very key juncture of world trade routes, and they were located along what are known as the Silk Roads. And these Silk Roads will really become important in the second wave, and that's when we'll talk about them more. But they are trade routes that link all the way from Eastern Europe through all parts of Asia. And so the Chinese make good use of this, and they start out by bartering objects that they don't want for things that they do want, and eventually they began using metal coins as a currency of exchange. In the second wave, Emperor Chen Shi Huangdi will actually standardize their measurements and their currency system, and they will begin to create silk, which is why it's called the Silk Roads. The Chinese were the only ones who knew how to create silk and had this technology until the third wave civilizations, when the technology was stolen from them. But until that time period, they had a monopoly on the production of silk. There really isn't a fall of ancient China. In fact, China probably has the most cultural continuity over 3,000 years, as well as political continuity of all of these different civilizations. However, the Shu dynasty does come to an end when the nobility decides to overthrow the emperor because they feel as though they've gained more power than him. And what ends up happening is that they form these 7 prominent states after years of fighting and political decentralization. You have these warlords who are still vying for power in these 7 states. And in fact, if you like martial arts films, the movie Hero with Jet Li shows this time period. Because just following the period of warring states, Emperor Chen Shi Huangdi actually reunites China in the second wave under the philosophy of legalism. And in the movie Hero, Jet Li actually represents a citizen from Emperor Qin's state, and he goes and he's able to defeat 2 of the best assassins from 2 of the other warring states. He's invited to Emperor Chen Shi Huangdi's palace in order to tell him his story, and from here things all go a little bit astray and everything is not what it seems. And in fact, the colors in this movie are absolutely beautiful, so I do encourage you to watch it for a more thorough history of China, as well as just for pure enjoyment. The very last of our first wave civilizations is the Olmec civilization, which was located in the heartland in the Gulf of Mexico. And the geography was swampy, lowlands, low hills and ridges. There were volcanoes here, and also there were mountains located to the north, so it was a fairly diverse kind of environment. Of all of the first wave civilizations, we know the least about the Olmec civilization, so this one will not be quite as in-depth as some of the other ones we have discussed. As far as religion in the Olmec civilization goes, we see a lot of cultural continuity between the religious beliefs of the first wave and the later Mayan civilization. They often had religious activities that were performed by their rulers, by full-time priests, as well as by shamans, and often they would use the San Pedro cactus for its hallucinogenic properties, and they would essentially get high, and they believed that they could communicate with the gods through doing this. We also see in several waves of civilization here the same god, Quetzalcoatl, who is the feathered serpent god. He's portrayed as a very fierce-looking serpent with wings, and also there was a myth in Mayan culture that he would return one day as a pale-skinned man, and this will become important when we talk about the conquistadors from Spain arriving in South America. The last things that we know about the Olmec religion may seem a little bit disturbing. One is that they practice ritual bloodletting, and there is a theory that they then drank this blood. And the reason for doing this is that they believe that in imbibing the blood of one of their prisoners of war or their captives, that they were also imbibing their power. And we also believe that there may have been a cannibalistic element to the human sacrifice that they practiced. And once again, they certainly wouldn't have eaten a whole body, but eating a small part of somebody would have represented, or actually for them, they would have believed that they were imbibing the power of that person. And so an example of this, if you've seen the movie Apocalypto, it's a fairly good portrayal of the way that human sacrifice may have been performed, although not necessarily of the sheer numbers, because it's very unlikely that they would have sacrificed as many people as you see in that movie. The Olmec civilization was originally a very simple and an egalitarian society, but over time it developed into a much more complex level of government, and we believe it was a theocratic government, and that there were municipal rulers who led the larger cities such as Teotihuacan, and they then immortalized the more important of these rulers in these very gigantic stone heads that were found throughout the basin of Mexico. And once again, you have this idea of divine right or a mandate of heaven in which the rulers were believed to have received their political legitimacy from the Olmec deities. The public building projects, like their pyramids and their large platform mounds, as well as their agriculture, their writing system, their artwork, and their statues, were all tied to the government. And perhaps the strangest of these is that we have found hundreds of these little angry fat baby statues that somehow have some kind of link to the Olmec government and social system, but we're unsure of exactly what that link is. As far as the economy of the Olmec civilization, we know that it was based on hunting and fishing, and that they did not have any kind of large-scale agriculture due to the lack of large domesticated animals. We also know that they developed very strong trading networks because there was this diffusion of Olmec artifacts throughout much of Mesoamerica, so that leads us to believe that they must have been trading with other groups, potentially trading all the way down into Norte Chico and up into the eastern woodlands. And we have seen examples of their greenstone as well as their marine shells traded to extremely faraway places that have allowed archaeologists to trace the roots of these trade networks over time. Really, the hallmark of the Olmec civilization, that for which it's most famous and most studied, is the artwork that we have found. And we found a great deal of little figurines and statues that portrayed humans and human-like subjects as well as animals. They're probably most famous for the Olmec figurines, like the giant colossal heads, and it's actually through these heads that historians have been able to make a connection between the Olmec people and the people of Africa. They see a lot of facial similarities between the people of Africa and the first wave civilizations in these colossal heads, which leads them to believe that there must have been some contact between the two areas. There are several innovations that can be attributed to the Olmec civilization as well, both scientific as well as technological innovations. And so the first would be that this is the first civilization in the Western Hemisphere to develop a writing system. And when we get into the time of the Mayans, they are going to be the only ones that have a writing system, which makes them quite unique and also quite advanced. Then they also developed what's called the long count calendar, which is actually a very complicated calendar system that was used by both the Olmec as well as by the Mayans later on. And you may have heard of it before because a lot of conspiracy theorists thought that because it ended in the year 2012, that the Earth was going to end in the year 2012. And they also developed the concept of zero, which figures prominently into their mathematical research. And there is an entire book written about the history of zero that you can actually get if you're interested in it. We also know that the ancient Olmec did a great deal of study into mathematics and into science, particularly astronomy. They knew a great deal about solar eclipses, for example, and we've been able to figure this out by looking at a book called the Dresden Codex that comes from the 16th century and tells us a great deal about the ancient knowledge that was gained over time in this first wave civilization. Of course, we could not leave off talking about the Olmec civilization without briefly discussing Teotihuacan, which was their largest city that housed almost 200,000 people. It had very broad avenues, such as the Avenue of the Dead, which was a 2.5-kilometer central avenue, and there would have been dozens of temples located here, 2 very large stepped pyramids, endless stone carvings and bright frescoes inside of the homes. And there would have also been very small apartments for, just ordinary workers lining the streets, as well as palatial homes for the particularly wealthy, where we have uncovered the most magnificent of the frescoes. And the largest pyramid here, known as the Sun Pyramid, is where you would have seen both political as well as religious events occurring. We don't really know what caused the fall of the Olmec civilization, but we do know that between 400 and 350 before the Common Era, the population in the eastern half of the Olmec heartland dropped precipitously and was only sparsely inhabited until the 19th century. We think that this is probably due to environmental changes that were triggered by tectonic upheavals, because remember, they were located right next to volcanoes, and also the silting of rivers that made the region unsuitable for any kind of large-scale agricultural work and the growth of farming industry. So this brings us to the end of our lectures on first wave civilizations. At this point, we've now covered the Indus River Valley, China, the Olmec, Norte Chico, Egypt, and also Mesopotamia. It's been a great deal of information in a short period of time, and I do recommend making a chart to help you to keep all of this information separate and to organize it in your head for when it comes time to take your quiz or to take your exam. And so at the end of this, I just have 3 questions for you to kind of think out in order to reflect on the material. The first would be how you think the lives of people in first wave civilizations differ from that of Paleolithic people. The second would be which of the first wave civilizations you would prefer to live in and why. And of course, this is going to be just a very personal reason that you might have. And then the last thing to think about would be, in this development of first wave civilizations, what do you think was actually gained for humankind and what do you think was lost? What changes about society forever that, can never be undone?